So I would like to open my contribution with a quotation that should help me to get immediately into the topic I will elaborate upon in the next 20 minutes or so. And I quote, "Before leaving the subject of practicing, I should like to add a word as to the value of the gramophone to the intelligent student. This is indeed a truly invaluable adjunct. He can hear them not only now and again, but as often as ever he likes, and by his own fireside. If he happens to be studying a particular role, he can be coached in this most practical and unrivaled manner by all the greatest artists of the day. He can take a particular aria and hear it sung by Caruso again and again until he is familiar with every detail of his rendering, can note his breathing, his phrasing, and every other detail in a manner which would be quite impossible by any other means. And having heard Caruso, he can then hear the same numbers sung by various other great artists if he chooses, and benefit still more by comparing their respective readings, by noting how they resemble one another or how they differ, as the case may be, incidentally learning in the process how widely one interpretation might differ from another and still be of the highest order. Certainly, it may be said that never before have students been so wonderfully helped." Now, were it not for words like gramophone and fireside, and the reference to the iconic but possibly passé figure of Enrico Caruso, we could think that this opinion, be expressed by one of our senior teachers, may be commenting on the plethora of recordings now available from the internet. Instead, this passage belongs to Luisa Tetrazzini's volume How to Sing, which she published in 1923. As we know, Luisa Tetrazzini was a pioneer of audio recordings, and as early as 1908, she admitted to using this to form an opinion about her colleagues' vocal and interpretive qualities. And I quote, "Have I ever heard Patti or Melba? Not until quite recently, except through a gramophone, which I listen to frequently." This is what she said to a journalist for the Sun on the 8th of March, 1908. Almost 100 years have passed since Tetrazzini prophetically expressed herself with regard to the advantages of using audio recordings as a tool for comparing different artists' performance styles. And it is common experience to see how often today's music students use their smartphones to watch videos from any available platform in order to learn a piece. Yet when it comes to choosing their reference artists, young musicians are more likely to focus on a near contemporary than an old master. In these years, a gap seems to have emerged between the widespread use of audio and video recordings and the manner in which music practitioners value early recordings in particular. Preliminary results from a case study aiming at a first examination of the extent of this gap confirm that even those singing teachers who are familiar with early recordings are unlikely to encourage students to take reference from the interpretation of, say, Adelina Patti and Luisa Tetrazzini. On the other hand, students' feedback reveals a stronger interest than one may expect. At the end of a teaching seminar on early recordings, many of them confessed how revealing the experience of early recordings had been, while some suggested that this kind of learning activity should become mandatory in all conservatoires. In short, there seems to be a friction between the manner in which early recordings are valued as a learning resource and the extent of their use as a practical teaching tool. A second critical reflection regards the manner in which scholarly literature on audio recordings fails to impact on performers' learning habits and strategies. A number of studies are now accessible and available, many of which adopt an empirical method, that is to say, a set of computer-based semi-automated data extraction techniques used in combination with descriptive and inferential statistical analysis. They are designed to bring empirical performance analysis into dialogue with other branches of musicological studies, and when possible, to draw evidence-based generalizations on early 20th century performance style. Still, it is common experience to see how rarely these articles are read in music conservatoires. Now, I individuated three possible reasons that may account for this. One, specialists from the empirical sciences use a jargon that a music practitioner might find difficult, if not impossible, to understand. Second, results are often tentative, especially if data sets are small and generalizations are arduous. And third, even when a particular era is examined more in detail, results show that individual differences outweigh the significance of larger period trends. All in all, scholarly publications, I would say, either fail to address questions that are relevant to them, so the practical relevance, or they do it in a manner that fails to reach them because of the comprehension question. Now, with these questions in mind, I have undertaken an investigation that explores the vocal performance practice of Luisa Tetrazzini, one of those singers who were trained in the Italian bel canto tradition and whose early recordings are a testament to this tradition. In a way, I took inspiration from Tetrazzini's own words, followed her advice, and started to note her breathing, phrasing, and every other detail in order to draw possible comparisons between her interpretations and those belonging to her predecessors and contemporaries. I adopted a threefold approach, which involves first defining those interpretive devices that were typical of the so-called bel canto tradition. Then I analyzed the manner in which she made use of ornamentation and cadenzas in particular in her recorded interpretations of the relevant repertoire. And then I compared her renditions with other sources, both earlier, so text-based, and contemporary, so discs. To start with, the expressive devices that were typical of the so-called bel canto tradition can be very quickly summarized as follows. The use of tempo rubato and larger tempo modifications, the use of portamento, the use of ornamentation, the modification of melodic passages, the insertion of a central semi-cadenza, and the insertion of a final cadenza or its modification should the composer have written one already. Now, contrary to our common understanding, these devices were meant to be used either alone or in combination to make the music more expressive and not to show off the voice at the expense of the composer. So proficient singers were expected to master these devices, and the extent of their use depend on many factors, both individual and repertoire related. Now I will show you a few examples which illustrate how these transcriptions can be used to draw interesting comparisons with earlier sources. The first example refers to the Recitativo and Cavatina di Amina in Bellini's Sonnambula, where there are three fermatas in the first section, the second of which is reproduced in the slide, and I will play it for you. Now, I emphasized the three, let's say, moments in the final cadenza that I would like to discuss. So, interestingly, the oldest source I could find concerning this fermata is in the chapter entitled Dell'articolazione del canto, so the articulation of singing, in Manuel Garcia's Method, published in 1842, where the author focuses on accentation and the distribution of the words. Garcia suggests that in specific situations it is possible to add further syllables in the lyrics or substitute for the written ones if their meaning allows it. So here I highlighted the two inserted syllables in Garcia's method. The two ha, which was typical. So, and the bottom stuff shows what we can see in the recorded publication, the recorded score. And you see Tetrazzini's rendition and then Marchesi, which I'm going to discuss soon. So Garcia does not draw attention to the modification present in the melody, which one may speculate were to be taken for granted, but to the exclamation ha added twice in order to adapt the lyrics to the predictably modified melodic line. The passage shows that the insertion of this first R should help singers to attack the top A with a more sonorous voice, the open vowel, before the modified descending passage. And the second insertion shows how the same stratagem can be used to vocalize in newly inserted cadential passage. Similar, although less demanding solutions to the cadenza are suggested in Mathilde Marchesi's Variante et Point d'Orgue, published in 1900. More interestingly, Tetrazzini does not follow Garcia's advice, and her cadence presents a simple arpeggio at the end of the trill. Now, what we see here is a kind of evolution towards a very richly ornamented example of this suggestion belonging to the Garcia mid-19th century, to what Mathilde Marchesi, who was a pupil of Garcia, suggests 50 years ago, more or less, and what Tetrazzini sings in her recording. And I would like to draw your attention to the trill. I don't know if the quality of the audio is good enough, but she adds this sort of accentuation in the trill, which is also described by Garcia in his method, and which is gone lost in the past century or so. So we have evidence of a living tradition, which once listened to through the recordings and transcribed can be analyzed more carefully by comparing what we hear in the recordings with what we see in other sources or from other sources. So the second example I want to show you is about the final fermata of the same cavatina with Tetrazzini's cadenza, as can be found again in her 1912 recording, compared with those left by Mathilde Marchesi in her 1900 volume. And I will play the cadenza for you. Again, we have the very simple suggestion written by Bellini, what Marchesi taught her students and what Tetrazzini does. And by way of comparison, we can check the individual style of each singer. Now, what is more interesting is to compare these two examples, which are almost contemporary, to what has been left by Laure Cinti-Damoreau in her Méthode, published in Paris 1849, which is extremely rich, I would say much more richly ornamented, and presents a typical displacement of the second chord of the cadenza. But if you take the number of notes that were, let's say, suggested as typical or normal in a singer from the mid-19th century, and you compare with what we find in early recordings, we can see the trajectory from one generation to the next and have, let's say, ways to compare the different examples in a very rich and in a very interesting way. The second set of examples I would like to show you belongs to, again, to Tetrazzini, and this time to two more singers, Marcella Sembrich and Nelly Melba. So the examples you see now belongs to the cadenza Tetrazzini has been singing and recording throughout her long career, as he confirmed by contemporary views of their live performances and her recorded interpretation. This is the Scena aria from the first act in Verdi's La Traviata. And in contemporary reviews, we find descriptions of the final top C with the incredible messa di voce, which we can hear as well, recordings. So the live performances and the recorded interpretation present the same features described by contemporary journalists and then fixed on the wax cylinders. What we can see here is the use of messa di voce, the ands, which was typical, but something more interesting is the way in which the same cadenza was sung again and again over the years. So the first recording was 1907 and then 1911 and July 1911. So 3 times the same. Now I want to show you what Nelly Melba sang in the same place, so the same cadenza. The style is completely different and fits well the image of a singer whose distance from Tetrazzini could not have been larger, as noted by John Pitt Sanborn from the Globe, who heard Tetrazzini and Melba many times. Her, Melba singing, was stereotyped without the excitement of the unexpected, the suddenly improvised, the inspiration of the heat and joy of song. Melba's style was rather mid-century French. So, of course, this is just a small example, but you see let's say, the richness of the cadenza does not even equal to what Verdi himself had suggested in a, let's say, notated score, a simple chord with 3 gruppettos, a descending line, and then basically a trill to conclude. Very simple, very schematic, I would say quite dry cadenza. If we compare the same passage to what Marcella Sembri, the Polish Patti, as she was named, used to sing a record during the same years, we see a very interesting evolution in her interpretive choices. So the first recording presents a slightly richer cadenza. I would say more notes are visible in the cadenza. The same year she took away a few notes, so simplified the cadenza slightly, and you can note that there's more differences in the 2 passages here. 1 year later, she simplified a little bit further the cadenza as she used to sing before, and then she remained, let's say, faithful. She remained true to this last interpretive decision for the following year. So we can again see the trajectory in the development of an interpretive idea, and at the same time we can look at the consistency over the years within the same piece, the same cadenza, the same interpretive choice. So many more examples could be discussed in order to verify the continuity that links these interpreters to the earlier generations and to investigate in how many different ways they embodied the same tradition. It is clear that the transcription of recorded interpretation fails to capture the utmost essence of the interpretation itself, which is its sound. By transcribing it, we operate a shift to a completely different sensory dimension, which involves an impoverishment and an oversimplification. But, on the other hand, by writing down what we hear, we may more easily focus on those details that would otherwise pass unnoticed even after repeated listening. Early recordings provide musicians with authoritative oral models from the past. These models can be used to recreate, not to duplicate or replicate our musical past. When used in combination with music notation, they become more easily accessible to music practitioners and can be made the object of in-depth critical scrutiny. Of course, this strategy does not work as well with other repertoires. While it is relevant to discuss change, textual manipulations, ornamentation, and cadences in a repertoire which was characterized by a distinctive use of these devices, the same cannot be said for other performative traditions. Still, preliminary work done with Conservatoire students suggests that similar strategies can be successfully used also when instrumental music is considered. Thank you.